Hey, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to the channel. And around a month ago, I made a video going over the best PC from 2012. It had all the best components you could buy 10 years ago, and I tested it in gaming and it didn't do too bad. The thing was, I kind of lied a bit. I was using the i7-3770K, which does fit the 2012 period, but I had that paired with the GTX 1650, which came out in 2019, not 2012. I was counting on the CPU bottleneck to limit the GPU enough so it would somewhat resemble the best graphics card for the time period, which was the GTX 690. So instead of hoping this GPU imposter would somewhat mirror the performance of a much differently spec'd and much older GPU, I just went to eBay and bought the thing. This was the best consumer-focused graphics card you could buy in the year 2012, and in this video, I'm going to be testing it in some modern games to see if it can somewhat retain the status of a usable GPU. And I'm also going to be seeing what type of performance we can expect to get from all of these parts put together. And I have a feeling it might not be as good as I'm hoping. So before we get into the real world game test, I'm just going to be going over all of the specs of the CPU and the GPU and comparing it to some modern counterparts like the GTX 1650 and the i3-10100F that I actually made a video on not too long ago. So if you do want to check that out, it'll be linked in the one of the cards above. So let's first start with the CPU, the i7-3770K. So just kind of a quick rundown. It's a 4-core, 8-thread processor that has a base frequency of 3.5 gigahertz, but it can be boosted to 5 gigahertz if you decide to overclock this. Unfortunately, I cannot with my motherboard. Comparing this to the i3-10100F, which is very similarly spec'd to the i7-3770K, we can see that there's quite a big gap between these two CPUs, but we'll have to see how much that actually transfers into the performance in gaming that we're about to see. Alright, so now on to the GPU. So this is the GTX 690 as I've said, and this is the GTX 1650. They are about 7 years apart, and this one has 4 gigabytes of VRAM and this one has 2. And when we get into the actual gaming benchmarks and gaming tests, the real world tests, we're going to see how that 2 gigabytes of VRAM is really going to be the limiting factor of this GPU, or actually GPUs. And that is right, this graphics card actually has 2 GPUs inside of it. That was the whole big selling point of this card when it came out all the way back in 2012, was that it could utilize SLI, so you could get pretty much double the performance you would normally get if SLI was disabled. And that's why you have to be really careful when you're looking up the specs for this GPU, because yes, I fell into that category of people too. I looked this up and I said, wow, this is actually only 10% slower on paper than the GTX 1650. But it's a lot more than that. Now, if we compare this to the GTX 1650, we can see that the 690 has a ton more CUDA cores. The 1650 only has 896. But the 1650 runs laps around the 690 when it comes to the base clock and the boost clock speed, with the base clock being 1485 megahertz and the boost clock being 1665. And with that said, let's get into the real world gaming tests of this GTX 690, the best GPU from 2012, but quite possibly the most painful gaming experience in 2022. So starting off the real world GPU test, I want to see what this GPU can perform and give to me in terms of graphical performance without any limitations. We're taking the i7 out of the picture. I slapped this into my main PC and I played some of my favorite modern titles so I could see this without any CPU bottleneck, and holy smokes did things start out rough. 8 frames per second in the Apex menu is not what I would call peak gaming. I must keep things in perspective though. This is a 10-year-old GPU, so hopping into the actual game, I was hoping that the single-digit frame rate immersion experience was just a fluke menu bug, and it kinda was. We did increase our frames per second by 200%, but that still only gave us 30 frames per second. That is handheld console type gameplay, and I'm not bashing handhelds, but 30 frames per second, even though technically playable, it really isn't. I'm still aiming high for the 60 FPS average in my brain here, so in a last-ditch effort to achieve the impossible, I turned everything off, so now we are literally below rock bottom. And I mean, I guess it worked a little bit. we're getting 50 frames per second now. The 2 gigabytes of VRAM, as I've talked about a lot already, is hurting this GPU a lot. Even if it just had a gigabyte more, I feel like we would be seeing much more stable and playable frame rates without having to butcher the settings so much and taking it down to like 640p. I think that test speaks for itself. The 690 did terrible in Apex Legends. With everything lowered, we still only mustered 50 frames per second, which most people would not even consider playable, even if it was at high settings. I'm hoping Valorant, which is the next game I'm going to be testing, will be able to deliver more stable performance, as that can be played on pretty much anything. And my guess was correct. We're actually getting 150 frames per second at low settings at 1080p. Not like 640p that we had the last time. So, I'd say that's pretty good performance. It's definitely playable. Even though this is not really a real test for a game, it's definitely nice to see a game that actually can run on this GPU, because after Apex, I started to lose hope. Now with the respectable games out of the way, it's time to stoop a little lower and play Fortnite. All jokes aside, I still really like Fortnite. It doesn't matter that it isn't cool to play anymore. It's fun, and I was hoping a bit of 2018 nostalgia could be delivered on a GPU teaming with 2012 nostalgia. It was sort of playable. I had to lower settings all the way to as low as possible and change the 3D resolution to 85%, but I was able to crank the view distance to the max and still rest at around 70 frames per second. Sure, the GPU was maxed out and the temps were atrocious, but that does not matter. Two relics of the past were able to join together like this without much compromise, and at the end of the day, I have to say I'm more than pleased. We still had one test left though. Any gaming benchmark would be incomplete without this game, and that is Sea of Thieves. Don't worry, I actually did test Minecraft on this GPU, and it did pretty darn well. I actually got around 250 frames per second with Optifine enabled, which is pretty good. But we're not here to talk about Minecraft. We're here to talk about Sea of Thieves. And I know I caught you a little bit off guard there. It's not the most popular game, but it's a game I really like. And because this is my video and this is my gaming benchmark, I want to play games that I want to play. And I love Sea of Thieves. The other reason why I decided to pick it was it's actually kind of hard for my 1650 to run with all the wave action. So this would be the ultimate test for the 690. If it could run Sea of Thieves, then it has my respect. This game just looks so beautiful, and at 1080p with low settings with a GTX 690, we average around 70 frames per second, which is pretty darn good in my opinion. It was getting a bit stuttery though, so I did decide to lower the resolution scaling down from 100 to 60%, and now we can actually get well over 100 frames per second. This does change the whole feel of the game. It's much less beautiful, but hey, it's playable gaming performance, and that's what we're looking for here. So now with the initial test done, how does the 690 pair with the i7-3770K? So Valorant was about the same performance, although there is a slight CPU bottleneck, but it's really not super noticeable. Valorant is still 100% playable. Apex Legends was not playable without the CPU bottleneck, so now with it included, we're getting between 30 to 40 frames per second, which is around a 20% reduction from before. The i7-3770K doesn't really help the 690 here in much regard, but I guess it did try its best. Onto Minecraft, which I did rudely skip over last time. I apologize for that. Unlike the 250 frames per second we were getting before the bottleneck, we're still getting around the 200 frames per second range at medium-low settings, which isn't too bad at 1080p. Well, it's Minecraft. That's more than playable. Onto Fortnite, there really wasn't any CPU bottleneck here because this is solely limited by the GPU, so I didn't really notice a huge difference in Fortnite. Hopping on Sea of Thieves once again, this is definitely limited by the i7-3770K, not as much as a game like Apex or Minecraft or Valorant, but there is still a bit of a bottleneck, so we're getting around 10 FPS less than we did before at 1080p with the resolution scaling set at 60%. To wrap things up, the best gaming PC from 2012 is not anywhere close to what the best is in 2022, but hey, that's kind of what I figured. To me, it's just really cool to be able to do builds like this of older hardware because I really like to see how it compares to, you know, kind of the lower end nowadays, and it's actually much worse than the lower end nowadays, but it's just cool to see how far technology has advanced. And while the 690 and the i7-3770K are not the ideal pair-up by any means anymore, it can still run quite a few titles at decent frame rates. Obviously, it does struggle a bit when things get intense, namely Apex Legends, but I was still pretty impressed with this PC. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I love making videos where I pretty much just get to game, even if the performance can sometimes be painful at times. And yeah, if you did enjoy it and you want to check out some of the products listed in today's video, but not to buy them, they can be checked out down below. And if you do want to check out any of the videos or things that I mentioned in this video, those will be in the card above, like I said, or in the description down below. Thank you all so much for watching. I am Nate from Hardwired Review, and I will catch you in the next one. I got some great content coming out very soon, more PC related stuff, so if you're excited for that, well, you know what to do. Peace.